Hello, my name is Dennis Chow. I'm the son of Australian activist, jailed Australian activist, Kham Chau. I'm here to raise awareness about the poor human rights issues in Vietnam, give my father a voice, and tell you my side of the story. Early last year, my father, now 70 years old, was in Vietnam on behalf of Viet Thanh, an international organization promoting reform through peaceful and political means. So how did I find out what happened to my father? Well, it was a week before my 29th birthday. At that point, I had been living in London for a couple of years, and it'd be typical that I'd call him every couple of weeks just to see what he'd been up to. I called, and to my surprise, there was no ring. I tried my mum next, and she answered. She sounded anxious, her voice trembled, and I knew something was up. At first, I could tell that my mum didn't want to tell me, and she didn't. I pestered her to the point of getting angry. I don't like secrets. She put my brother on the phone, and from this I have vivid memories of this conversation. I remember it well. I could overhear my brother talking to my mum. We need to tell him. We need to let him know. We cannot hide this from him. And finally, he told me. Dad had been missing for a couple of days. He had gone to Vietnam. I panicked and paused. What do you mean he went to Vietnam? What do you mean he's missing? He replied, that's all we know. We know the police had visited Auntie's house, questioning on her what she knew about Dad. That's all we know. No one had spoken to him in the past couple of days. My heart immediately sank. Imagine a loved one being snatched off the street. No confirmation, no explanation, no update. He was already missing a few days at this point. I had an idea of what my father was up to since he had retired. I knew it involved promoting democracy and human rights. I knew from what I read in the papers that such advocacy and holding the government to account for its transgressions would not sit well with Vietnamese authorities. So what happened in the years following his arrest? After hearing about my father's detention, I had learned that he had been arrested on suspicions of crimes committing to overthrow the Vietnamese government. We were told by the Australian consulate that he'd be held for a 4-month investigation period. This meant no visitors, no lawyers, and the only updates we had were from the Australian consulate, which came only once a month. My mother was allowed to write nondescript letters, which were handled by prison officials before being passed to my father. The consulate visits were flanked by prison and correctional officers. My father's responses were also nondescript and contained little to no information. These letters, which censored my father's real voice and character, contrasted greatly from his usual outgoing self. With this in mind, I feared that anything said against the administration would result in further punishment. They succeeded in silencing him. His 4-month investigation period was extended by a further 8-month period, adding to my family's anxiety caused by his absence. We were then abruptly informed about his trial, which was not given any semblance of due process. The entire charade was rushed and improper. He was assigned a lawyer who was allowed a 1-hour session with my father in person prior to the trial. I'd like to repeat, my father was given a 1-hour consult with his lawyer after being subject to an investigation for 11 months. He was tried along other associated members of the Viet Thanh rights group. Neither media nor family members were allowed access to the courtroom. They were held waiting outside by the gates, only to see a glimpse of their loved ones' fates. In quick succession, the trial was wrapped within 4 hours in what was a wholesale predetermined verdict. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison. The whole affair left me thinking, how could this injustice be done to my father, a person whose only crime was calling for a more free and democratic Vietnam? So what's his situation now? The next day after the trial, I saw a photo of my father in the courtroom. He looked defiant, but much older than I last remembered. Jail hadn't been good to him. This is the first I'd seen him all year. In the monthly consulate emails, his voice is raised as part of the correspondence. From what little information I do know, his condition is not great and the list of illnesses continues to grow. He is held in a cell for 23 hours of the day with 1 hour of exercise permitted. His mental health is deteriorating. We've made requests for family visitation, none of which have been granted. My father turned 70 last year, and so with a 12-year sentence, he'll be 82 when he is released. Factoring in the prison conditions and poor access to medical treatments, it is effectively a death sentence. So I asked myself, why did my father go back to Vietnam in the first place? My father isn't a fool, and he would have known about the dangers of returning to Vietnam, but he went anyway. My father came to Australia with nothing but the clothes on his back as a refugee after the Vietnam War. He worked hard all his life to make something for him and his family in his new adopted home. He grew proud to be an Australian, proud of the freedoms we take for granted. I feel as though my father left the land he loved. He left something behind. He knew the freedoms we have here were the virtues that his people lost. I knew he felt for the people of Vietnam. This is why he felt compelled to advocate and effect change. He never abandoned his sense of duty to call for a more open and free society in Vietnam. So what can you do to help? Right now, in this moment, it is devastating that I cannot end my father's 12-year sentence, that I do not know when we'll see each other next. But there are ways that you can help. I hope the international community will continue to highlight my father's case to Scott Morrison, the current Australian Prime Minister, and the Australian government. The Australian government must be held to a higher regard as a Western democracy and not to put trading relations above basic human rights, the ones we hold so dear. As trading partners of Vietnam, you are also accountable for the treatment of its people when you sign that trade agreement. I'll be unwavering in my mission to keep my father's voice and story alive, and I hope you may feel compelled to do the same. Thank you for listening.